Welcome to the latest edition of our Talk Death video series, where you get the chance to ask experts your questions about all things death and dying.
A reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to follow us on Instagram at TalkDeath Daily for your daily dose of death positivity.
Today's guest is Cassandra Yonder, a fellow Canadian advocating for community-centered death care. Cassandra wants to encourage cultural re-engagement with dying, death care, and grief.
Cassandra runs one of the largest Facebook groups dedicated to alternative death care practices, as well as deathcaring.ca, a virtual school for community death caring. Check out the description below to learn more about Cassandra and deathcaring.ca.
Welcome, Cassandra.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sort of on this note, it's actually almost a follow-up from Tanya from Facebook as well. And she's asking if MAID, and for those who don't know, that's medical assistance in dying, if it's had much of an impact on the Canadian death care space. How does the community work to support this option, given there are moral, spiritual implications for practitioners?
Aren't there lots of implications of MAID? Oh my goodness. Yeah, I kind of tend to dance around this kind of question because I feel like the community death care movement presumes to be in favor of medical aid in dying. I think that there seems to be an assumption that the two movements are 100% aligned. And I don't find that to be the case. I mean, I don't think that that's true. I think that they definitely affect one another, both movements, in a really big way, and we can talk about some of those ways. But it would be way too oversimplified to say that MAID is part of the community death care movement, or that there's any kind of symbiotic relationship to that extent. The reason that I kind of tend to avoid the topic of MAID is that because I don't want to see my work as a community death care provider. I don't feel like I have an expert opinion on MAID because of my role. So with the understanding that I don't feel that I personally have expertise, I'll go on to share my own opinion, which is that it's just the conversation's kind of coming in at a funny spot. I think that MAID almost just exemplifies the state of alienation that we're in from caring for our own dead. It's kind of like jumping in. Like, I would never say that I'm opposed to MAID, because how can you say that you're opposed to people having an autonomous choice about anything, right? Like, I can't find myself in opposition to MAID. But at the same time, I just feel like it's too late and it's asking all the wrong questions. I mean, if we were really caring for our own dead, we would be arriving at that point in such a different place. I mean, I think there's a whole slew of interesting stuff to bring up around that. And again, I'm not an expert, but I kind of look at sort of the history coming from like a euthanasia sort of orientation background, and then looking at it coming from an assisted suicide type background, and the way that that's converged and the public dialogue that's happening around it. I think people are looking at what do they deserve as autonomous patients. Mm-hmm. And the conversation so quickly becomes about the right to die. But it's so much more complicated than that, because it's not just about the right to die. It's about your right to have someone else assist you in killing yourself, which is really quite a different conversation. And so, I mean, I could go on and on about this too, but I think that so many people who find themselves strongly in agreement with MAID would also not be in an agreement with my 10-year-old son being able to go to the local hospital and say, look, I've been depressed for a couple months. Can you assist me to commit suicide right now, right? So even people that are pro-MAID have edges to that. And that's what we're all talking about, is where are those edges?
Yeah, exactly.
Where are those edges? But philosophically, some of my colleagues who I very much respect are holding some really, really important questions that I think aren't coming out in the social media about medical aid in dying. And it's about these sort of ideas around duty to die. It's about the idea around I think in our culture, we've come to hold our own personal sense of autonomy above all else. Above all else, we're not part of communities anymore. Mm. And I just like to think, like, for me, advanced planning is so much about creating a community to die into. I know I'm saying something really big and just kind of saying it in a short, flippant way, but it's really, that's my lifetime work, is to create a community to die into. Because we look at, like, incompetency as having nothing left to, like, not being productive anymore, and therefore not having any more value. And I think we need to find ways to become incompetent and so that our community carries us. The same way when babies are born, we don't expect babies to worry that they're burdening us with their poopy diapers. I mean, that doesn't even enter our consciousness.
Right.
So I just feel like we become so alienated from death caring that this question of our parents burdening us with their poopy diapers has even arrived in front of us to look at. Like I wish that people didn't have to wonder about themselves being a burden, I guess.
That's definitely a question that I think a lot of people in that state have. I feel like it's almost two-part in the sense that on one end there's this discussion about, you know, being a burden, but then there's that other discussion that I think it was Brittany Myers that really brought up when, you know, you have a terminal illness that's only going to get worse and your quality of life is going to be so reduced that, you know, that's where that autonomous decision is important. But you have, it's really the two sides of the spectrum. And I feel like, you know, just like you mentioned, you know, a 10-year-old boy being able to go out and ask, you know, for someone to help him with that because he's being depressed. It's like, it's such a case by case scenario. I feel like the middle ground is the case by case basis, but then how are we actually going about, you know, the criteria of this and who's essentially playing God? How many doctors does it take to do that? So,
well, and governments also don't legislate in the middle, right? They do tend to legislate in the margins, and so you need, in many ways, you need to pick a side, at least at a legislative level.
Yeah.
And that gets complicated, and I appreciate that this, you know. Yeah. This question of middle ground, or this question of you know, polar opposites when it comes to this discussion, and it's, you know, it's a problem that people like mental health advocates are talking about, people within disability communities are talking about.
I think that a lot of people also want to justify the complete argument very clearly by saying things like intolerable suffering. And there again, that just makes me want to step back to say, like, who decides what intolerable suffering is, and how are people being given the message that their suffering is intolerable? I guess that goes to what you're speaking about. Like, there's a question of autonomy, and there's also a question of what's coming from the outside, what messaging is around it. I think when we decide that other people's suffering is intolerable or unbearable, I feel like we haven't maybe fully explored how we can accompany people through suffering, how we can be compassionate in our communities, how we can be compassionate in our culture, in our society. So that's another place that I go in my mind when I look at suffering. Maybe we're not very good for showing up for suffering anymore. And maybe suffering has a lot to teach us. Maybe being able to sit with suffering has a lot of benefit to bring to our communities. I mean,
and even
to look at Steve Jenkinson's,
too, you know, the person themselves that's actually suffering as well. Like, what, you know, it's also hard to know, like, what your threshold can be, right?
Yes. Yeah. And look at childbirth in that case, right? Like, you know, I don't mind sharing that I'm the total pro home birth, no drugs, natural childbirth mama, but that doesn't make me like tolerant of pain.
Yeah.
You know, like when I was going through those situations, in retrospect, I'm very happy that I had the support from my caregivers that knew that I wanted to be supported through that type of suffering for a larger purpose. And so, suffering's just a really big, complex question, right? And so, yeah, we can't talk about MAID in 5 minutes, but I'm really glad that Tanya brought that question up, because I do think that what you're bringing forward in this presentation is that there's an assumption that MAID and community death care go hand in hand, and clearly they don't. I think there's some really important relationships to investigate between those two movements.